Now, what if I told you that some of Genesis's most popular albums are actually some of their worst? Stay with me as I break down what Ultimate Classic Rock got completely wrong in their ranking of these iconic records. Now, when we talk about Genesis, we're really talking about three distinct eras of the band. Now, first you've got the progressive rock era with Peter Gabriel at the helm. Then the progressive and pop hybrid era with Phil Collins. And finally the full-on pop phase with Collins, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford driving the ship. Over the years, Genesis gave us 15 studio albums from 1969 to 1991, and really spanning everything from complex prog epics to chart-topping pop hits. And right away, I have to say that Ultimate Classic Rock, UCR, have some interesting opinions on these albums. So let's break it down a little and take a look. At number 15, they've got Calling All Stations from 1997. Now, they say the band's final offering is not really a Genesis album so much as the sound of desperation on the part of guitarist Mike Rutherford and keyboardist Tony Banks. Strong words. The last men left standing wrote to new singer Ray Wilson when Phil Collins' departure forced an attempt on the pair's part to justify their continued existence as a creative unit. Unfortunately, that justification was doomed from the start by indistinct songwriting, washed-out production, and general malaise. Harsh words. Now, I say, calling this a Genesis album really feels like a mistake to me. Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford really should have created a new project instead of trying to trade on the old band's name, in my opinion. Ray Wilson, the vocalist that is on this album, he's a really good singer, he really is. But he deserved better than this. Tracks themselves, well, they aren't actually terrible, but the album lacks that essence of what makes a true Genesis record. There was extended fade-outs, and it just doesn't belong in the official catalogue, at least not in my book. At number 14, We Can't Dance from 1991. Now, UCR say, we could have lived with videos of Phil Collins, Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks mugging like a British ZZ Top if there had been anything approaching actual songs to go along with it. Instead, Collins' final album with Genesis is full of obnoxious, overproduced pop pap. Most of the tracks sound like cast-offs from one of his solo albums. When the meagre charms of a song like I Can't Dance are a highlight, you're in big trouble. Don't think they like that album. I say, when We Can't Dance came out, it had this undeniable end-of-the-road feeling to it. And let's be real, most of the songs on this album just aren't that good. But then there's Fading Lights. Now, if you've never heard this track, do yourself a favour and listen to it. It's one of Genesis's best songs ever, it really is, and a perfect closing statement on their career. Without it, the album would be completely forgettable. At number 13, Invisible Touch from 1986. Ultimate Classic Rock said, on the dark day in Genesis history when this record was released, the band fully transitioned from art rock glory to radio ready piffle, replete with all the worst that the 80s overproduction had to offer. The fact that just the tiniest bit of old Genesis is discernible in a couple of tracks is the only thing that edges this album a notch ahead of We Can't Dance. Now, for me, Invisible Touch marked the end of Genesis' writing music with real purpose. At this point, they were clearly aiming for a radio hit. It's not an album I'm a fan of at all. Now, if it weren't for Domino and the Brazilian, this really would be heading straight for the trash bin. Those tracks save it from total disaster. At number 12, From Genesis to Revelation from 1969. Ultimate Classic Rock said, There's nothing at all wrong with the band's debut album, but it bears very little resemblance to the Genesis the world would come to know. Instead of prog, it's filled with 60s sounding orchestral pop. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That is more in common with perhaps the early Bee Gees, of whom producer Jonathan King was a big fan, and the Zombies, but it isn't quite on their level. Now, every band has an embryonic phase, and this was theirs. I say, quite controversially, I've never listened to this album, and I honestly don't plan to. It was a project that was cooked up first by the manager, Jonathan King, and it doesn't reflect the band's identity for me in any shape or form. Now, unless someone is paying me to review it, I'll pass. At number 11 was Genesis The Shapes album from 1983. UCR said, Everything would have been perfectly fine if Genesis would have just walked away after this self-titled album. Sure, it had plenty of poppy moments, but they aren't buried in the era's production cliches. That's all feels charmingly McCartney-esque rather than obnoxiously 80s. And Mama and Home by the Sea even sound like they could have come from the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway era. I'm not sure about that one. I say, by the time this album came out, Genesis was well into their pop phase. Mama was a huge hit, and while it's a bit reminiscent of Phil Collins' solo work, it's still a strong track. Home by the Sea is another highlight, but Illegal Alien, well, let's just say that one hasn't aged too well. Overall, for me, it was a mixed bag of shapeless pop songs, and the occasional nod to their prog roots. Number 10, it's Duke from 1980. UCR say, this album marked a major turning point for the band. It occupies a perfectly balanced place between Genesis' proggy past and their poppy future. They were really just beginning to take a more accessible turn on the tracks like Misunderstanding and Turn It On Again. But there was still plenty of prog elements on board, really to satisfy old school admirers. Okay, what do I think? Well, I like Duke. Turn It On Again is a great single. But Misunderstanding, that was clearly aimed at cracking the US market for me, and it's just too lightweight. However, the Duke Suite that closes the album, that's a strong piece of music. At number 9, Abacab from 1981. Ultimate Classic Rock said of lots of 70s prog bands had tried to reboot themselves for the 80s, but nobody did it better than Genesis. At least for one album. The subsequent releases would bring diminishing returns. Abacab was a triumph. Against all odds, the trio totally reinvented itself, taking on the influence of the new wave era and jettisoning all the 70s prog rock excess. The place they ended up was really an uncharted new paradigm that worked shockingly well and brought them loads of new fans in the bargain. For me, this is really where things got interesting. Abacab was Genesis trying to fit into the 1980s, and it didn't always work. No Reply at All with its Earth, Wind and Fire style brass doesn't sit well with me. But the Dodo-Lurker combination, it's fantastic. The experimental whodunit was a total miss though, a real disaster. At number 8, and then there were 3 from 1978, and Ultimate Classic Rock said, even though it contains the band's first big pop hit, undeniably appealing Follow You, Follow Me, and was, as the title indicates, the debut of the Phil Collins, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks lineup. This is really the swan song of old school Genesis. And as such, it's a fine farewell to the prog rock days of yore, sporting a generous supply of epic art rock moments. For me, this was Genesis finding their footing post-Steve Hackett, straddling pop and prog. Tracks like Down and Out and Snowbound are great, but then you've got Follow You, Follow Me, which really signalled where they were heading, straight into pop territory. At number 7, Wind and Wuthering from 1976, an ultimate classic rock, says this time, the final album to feature guitarist Steve Hackett, a key contributor to the sound of the band's classic era. Wind and Wuthering found Genesis still sitting quite comfortably in the world they've been inhabiting since the start of the decade. There was a lone attempt at a pop song, Your Own Special Way, and that was on the half-hearted side and didn't really stick, leaving plenty of room for elaborate instrumental highlights that sound like prime Genesis. For me, this album was the end of Genesis's progressive era, and it happened much too soon, in my opinion. Steve Hackett's guitar work on this album is absolutely stellar, and the songs like The 11th Earl of Mar and Afterglow are standouts. It's an excellent album, and it's a bittersweet finale to their true prog era. At number 6 is A Trick of the Tail from 1976, and ultimate classic rock said at the time, it probably seemed unlikely that Genesis could possibly survive the departure of a frontman as distinctive and charismatic as Peter Gabriel, until they tossed a vocal mic behind the drum kit. For the most part, the first album with Phil Collins as lead singer is indistinguishable from the band's mid-70s heyday, especially since Collins hadn't quite sussed out his own vocal style yet, and was still echoing Gabriel's inflections. Not a bad thing in this context. For me, though, when Peter Gabriel left, the band had to prove that they could continue without him. And they absolutely did with this album. There's not a bad track on it. It's a near perfect example of Genesis successfully transitioning to the Phil Collins era without losing their prog sensibilities. As simple as that. At number 5, we've got Trespass from 1970. UCR says, while neither Phil Collins nor Steve Hackett had come aboard yet, Genesis, their second album, is widely considered as their proper debut. I agree with that. And although it concentrates more on acoustic guitar tapestries than subsequent albums, Trespass creates the template for pioneering prog statements that were just around the corner for the band. Now, for me, this album isn't quite fully formed yet, but it's a really solid effort. The Knife and Stagnation are fantastic tracks, and Anthony Phillips' contribution can't be overstated enough. His departure after this album would change really the band's trajectory, but it remains a great early prog record. Number 4 is Nursery Rhyme from 1971. UCR said this is where the band really started strutting its stuff for the first time, with the classic Peter Gabriel, Steve Hackett, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Phil Collins lineup in place. Genesis began developing the complex writing style and dazzling instrumental interplay that really would become their trademarks for the rest of the decade. They started to put prog rock on the map straight out of the gate with the opening epic, The Musical Box, which remains a fan favourite to this day. Now, my opinion on this one is that it's really quite an underrated gem. It introduced us to the classic lineup and gave us The Musical Box, which is an absolute classic. This album really set the stage for the band's golden period. At number 3, we've got Foxtrot from 1972 with ultimate classic rock saying, when you're talking Genesis, it doesn't get much better than Foxtrot. The jaw-dropping sweep of the 23-minute Supper's Ready, the magisterial mellotron of Watcher of the Skies, the cutting, almost Kinks-like socio-political commentary of Get 'Em Out by Friday. This all adds up to the peak of the band's canon. Not to mention one of the greatest prog albums ever to toss tricky time signatures at listeners' eager ears. I say that I just simply love Foxtrot. Those 3 tracks, Watches of the Sky, as one of the greatest Mellotron openings ever. Get 'Em Out by Friday is an amazing example of the Genesis' ability to tell stories through their music. And Sucker's Ready, it's often is ranked as one of the top prog tracks of all time. I can't argue with that. At number 2, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway from 1974, with ultimate classic rock saying a sizable segment of Genesis fan base would give Peter Gabriel's Last Stand with the band top ranking. And really, there's no question it is one of their best, with their elaborate art rock coming through at its most visceral. But concept albums are a tricky business, especially double albums. And really the fact that one wanders astray in a couple of spots over the course of its considerable length means that it cedes its claim to the primary position. That's a fair comment. For me, though, The Lamb is a complex and fascinating album, but I've always felt like it's more of a perhaps Peter Gabriel solo record than a true Genesis album. Steve Hackett is barely present on it, or appears to be barely present, which is a real shame. Sides 1 and 2 are brilliant, but sides 3 and 4, I don't feel they're as strong. The number 1 spot, you probably guessed it, is Selling England by the Pound from 1973, with ultimate classic rock saying the albums that occupy the top 3 spots on our list of Genesis albums ranked worst to best are all exceptional and represent not only the pinnacle of prog rock, but a high point for the 70s rock in general. On one hand, Selling England by the Pound's quirky hooky I Know What I Like in Your Wardrobe was the closest that Genesis came to a radio song at that point. On the other hand, The Cinema Show and The Battle of Epping Forest are prime examples of the broad range of possibilities of prog's ascendance brought to the table. For me, this is a masterpiece, the perfect blend of folk and prog elements. It's no wonder this album is often considered by their fans to be the best. Critically, it's ranked very favourable as well. But what about my personal worst to best? Here's how I see it. Equal 15, Calling All Stations and From Genesis to Revelation. They're not really Genesis albums. Equal 13, Abacab, Invisible Touch, We Can't Dance. These were experiments, some successful, some not, but ultimately not the band at the best. At 10, Genesis Shapes, a blend of pop and prog with some great tracks, but not a cohesive whole. 9, And Then There Were Three, a transitional album as the band figured out life post-Hackett. 8, Duke, great, but clearly aimed at the US market for me. 7, Nursery Crime, underrated and fantastic. 6, Trespass, a beautiful folk-tinged album. 5, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, the end of the Gabriel era. 4, A Trick of the Tail, an important and successful transition album. 3, Foxtrot, a true prog masterpiece. Equal first, Selling England by the Pound and Wind and Wuthering. Both are essential Genesis albums. One is the pinnacle of their prog mastery, the other the bittersweet end of that era. So that's my ranking of the Genesis studio albums. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching this one, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.